In the early months of 1944, a deep, unsettling silence hung over the Air Defense Headquarters in Tokyo. For years, the Japanese military had prided itself on the absolute defense perimeter, believing that the vast distances of the Pacific and the ferocity of their fighter pilots would keep the home islands untouchable. But on radar screens across the coast, a new kind of ghost began to appear. It was a blip that moved with a terrifying speed and, more importantly, at an altitude that defied the technical manuals of the Imperial Japanese Army. They called it the Silver Phantom. This was the B-29 Superfortress, and its arrival would represent a new kind of nightmare for the Japanese High Command, a technological shock that felt more like an alien invasion than a conventional war. The first time the B-29s appeared over the Japanese horizon, the ground crews and anti-aircraft officers were paralyzed by what they saw. High above the clouds, at an altitude of nearly 30,000 feet, tiny silver specks glinted in the sunlight. To the naked eye, they looked like beautiful, slow-moving jewelry against the deep blue of the stratosphere. But to the Japanese radar operators, they were a catastrophe. Japanese fighters like the Mitsubishi Zero and the Nakajima Oscar were designed for the dogfights of the Pacific, agile, light, and deadly at 15,000 feet. But at the heights where the B-29s cruised, the air was too thin for Japanese engines to breathe. Japanese commanders initially refused to believe the data. They assumed their instruments were malfunctioning. "No bomber can carry a heavy payload at such a height," one colonel reportedly remarked during a briefing. But the reality became undeniable when the first bombs began to fall. The B-29 was not just a plane, it was a pressurized, heated, and computerized fortress. While the American crews sat in comfortable cabins, wearing light flight suits and breathing normally, the Japanese pilots scrambled to meet them in unpressurized cockpits where the temperature dropped to -40 degrees. The psychological impact of the Silver Phantom was devastating. Japanese civilians would look up and see the white condensation trails, the fingers of God, stretching across the sky, knowing that no weapon in Japan's arsenal could reach them. The anti-aircraft shells would explode thousands of feet below the bombers, looking like harmless puffs of black smoke. It was a visual demonstration of a power gap that spirit and bravery could not bridge. The B-29 didn't just bring fire, it brought the realization that the Americans had mastered the sky in a way that rendered the Japanese Empire obsolete. For the Japanese High Command, the B-29 was a new kind of nightmare because it removed the warrior from the equation. The Americans were no longer fighting a war of men against men. They were fighting a war of altitude. The Japanese generals who had spent decades perfecting the art of the sword and the spirit were now staring at a silver machine that flew so high it seemed to belong to another world. The Silver Phantom had turned the Japanese sky into an American laboratory, and for the people of Tokyo, the nightmare was only just beginning. In the freezing, thin atmosphere above Japan, a quiet but deadly struggle was taking place that no amount of samurai spirit could win. This was the oxygen gap, a technical chasm that turned the legendary pride of the Japanese Air Force into helpless observers of their own destruction. For years, the Mitsubishi A6M0 had been the symbol of Japanese aerial supremacy, a light, lethal, and incredibly agile machine. But as the B-29 superfortresses arrived at altitudes exceeding 30,000 feet, the Zero and the men who flew it hit a wall made of physics. The crisis was rooted in the engine. Most Japanese fighters used single-stage or two-stage superchargers that were optimized for the dense air of lower altitudes. As a pilot pushed his stick forward to intercept the silver giants looming above, the air became dangerously thin. By the time a Japanese pilot reached 25,000 feet, his engine would begin to gasp. The lack of oxygen meant the fuel wouldn't burn efficiently. The engine would vibrate violently, losing horsepower rapidly. The controls, once crisp and responsive, became mushy and sluggish. To the pilots, it felt like trying to swim through molasses while wearing a lead suit. The human cost was even more brutal. While the B-29 crews operated in the heated, pressurized environment, essentially a flying office where they could work in shirt sleeves, the Japanese interceptor was a primitive metal shell. Japanese pilots had to rely on crude oxygen masks that often leaked or froze solid in the extreme cold. At 30,000 feet, the temperature inside a Nakajima K-44 cockpit would plummet to minus 50 degrees Celsius. Pilots reported their breath freezing onto their goggles, blinding them at the most critical moment of the attack. Their fingers would grow numb, making it nearly impossible to pull the trigger of their pannons. Japanese diaries from this period are filled with a sense of agonizing frustration. One pilot, Saburo Sakai, noted that the B-29s looked like majestic silver whales swimming in a calm sea, while the Japanese fighters below were like exhausted minnows struggling to breach the surface. Commanders on the ground watched in horror as their best pilots stalled their aircraft and fell into uncontrollable spins, simply trying to coax their machines just a few hundred feet higher. The oxygen gap, the belief that a superior pilot could overcome any technical disadvantage, was being suffocated by the lack of oxygen. The high command eventually realized that bravery was no substitute for a turbo supercharger. They began to strip their fighters of everything, armor plating, heavy cannons, even radios, just to shed enough weight to reach the B-29's cruising altitude. But even then, once they arrived, they were so close to a stall that they could barely maneuver to aim. The oxygen gap had created a two-tiered war. The Americans were fighting in the future, while the Japanese were gasping for air in the past. It was the moment the Japanese military elite understood that the war wouldn't be won by the sharpest sword, but by the engine that could breathe where men could not. To the Japanese pilots who managed to claw their way into the thin, frozen air of the upper atmosphere, the B-29 Superfortress was no longer just an airplane. It was a terrifying mechanical deity. They called it the Fortress in the Stratosphere. As the Japanese interceptors struggled to stay airborne in the oxygen-starved heights, they realized they weren't just fighting a bomber, they were fighting the most advanced piece of technology ever built. The B-29 was a flying robot, a pressurized marvel that used computers and remote-controlled turrets to turn the sky into a lethal kill zone before a Japanese pilot could even get within range. The primary shock for the Japanese High Command was the B-29's central fire control system. In every other bomber of the war, gunners sat behind their weapons, bracing against the wind and manually aiming at moving targets. But the B-29 was different. Its gunners sat inside heated, pressurized plexiglass, bubbles far away from the actual guns. They used small handheld sights connected to an analog computer. When a gunner tracked a Japanese fighter through his sight, the computer automatically calculated the lead, the wind speed, and the gravity drop. It then electronically moved the heavy .50 caliber machine gun turrets on the outside of the plane.
For the Japanese pilots, this was a nightmare they couldn't comprehend. They would approach a B-29 from what they thought was a blind spot, only to see the turret on top of the bomber spin around with unnatural robotic speed and lock onto them. The flying robot was capable of concentrating fire from multiple turrets onto a single target. One Japanese veteran pilot described the experience. It was as if the plane had 100 eyes. No matter where we moved, the guns were already waiting for us. It didn't feel like a man was shooting. It felt like the machine itself was hunting us. Furthermore, the B-29 was a miracle of comfort in a theater of war defined by suffering. While the Japanese pilots were shivering, their lungs aching for air and their goggles frosted over, the American crews were breathing conditioned air. They could talk to each other over clear intercoms and even enjoy hot coffee from thermoses. This disparity in technology created a profound psychological rift. The Japanese commanders realized that the Americans had successfully removed the human element of exhaustion and cold from the battle. The B-29 was a pressurized sanctuary that allowed its crew to remain calm and focused, while the Japanese interceptors were fighting a losing battle against both the enemy and the environment. By late 1944, the fortress in the stratosphere had become a symbol of American industrial might that Japan simply could not match. The B-29 featured 5 remote-controlled turrets that could fire in any direction, making a traditional tail chase or head-on attack almost suicidal. The Japanese generals looked at the blueprints of captured B-29s and were silenced by the complexity of the electrical systems. They realized that while they were still building planes of wood and light metal, the Americans were building computers that could fly. The stratosphere was no longer a neutral battlefield. It was a high-altitude fortress where the laws of technology had replaced the ancient code of the warrior. As the fire raids over Tokyo intensified, the Japanese High Command reached a state of cold, calculated desperation. They had realized a terrifying truth. Their cannons were too weak, their engines too slow, and their pilots too exhausted to stop the B-29s through conventional means. The Silver Phantoms were simply too durable. American bombers were returning to base with hundreds of bullet holes, their massive airframes absorbing 20mm cannon fire like a giant absorbing bee stings. To save the homeland, the Japanese military turned to their most ancient and tragic tradition, the sacrifice of the self. This was the birth of the Shinten Seiku, Heavenly Shadow units, specialized air-to-air ramming squads. These were not the kamikaze pilots of the sea who targeted ships. These were elite interceptor pilots who were ordered to use their aircraft as human bullets against the giants in the sky. The commanders issued a chilling order: strip the fighters of everything. To reach the 30,000-foot cruising altitude of the B-29, pilots removed their heavy machine guns, their armor plating, and even their parachutes to save weight. The mission was no longer to shoot down the enemy, it was to physically collide with them. The tactics were as brutal as they were primitive. A Japanese pilot, often flying a Nakajima K-44 or a Kawasaki K-61, would climb for nearly an hour, gasping for oxygen until he was positioned slightly above and ahead of a B-29 formation. Then he would enter a steep, high-speed dive, aiming not for the fuselage, but for the bomber's vulnerable tail or its massive engines. The goal was to shear off the B-29's horizontal stabilizer with the fighter's propeller or wing. American B-29 crews began to report horrifying sights in their after-action logs. They described Japanese fighters appearing out of the sun, making no attempt to fire their guns, and instead flying directly into the bomber's wings.
In one famous incident over Tokyo, a Japanese pilot named Tadao Sumi rammed a B-29, destroying it instantly, and miraculously survived by clinging to the wreckage of his own plane before falling into a rice paddy. But for most, the collision was a one-way trip. The Japanese commanders were shocked not just by the courage of their pilots, but by the resilience of the B-29 even after being rammed. There are documented cases of B-29s losing an entire engine or a large portion of a wing to a ramming attack, and still flying 1,500 miles back to their bases in the Marianas. This desperate measure was a psychological double-edged sword. While it terrified the American crews, it also signaled the total bankruptcy of Japanese military technology. They were trading their most experienced pilots and their last remaining aircraft for a single American bomber that the U.S. industrial machine could replace in a matter of days. By early 1945, the sight of human bullets in the stratosphere became a common, tragic occurrence. The Japanese High Command watched from their bunkers as their Air Force literally threw itself against the silver wall of the B-29s, only to see the formations keep coming, wave after wave. It was the ultimate admission of defeat. When the mind could no longer find a way to win, the body was the only weapon left to throw. By the summer of 1945, the Japanese High Command had reached a grim, inescapable conclusion. The sky over Japan no longer belonged to the Emperor. It belonged to the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. The end of the sky was not just a metaphorical phrase, it was a physical reality where the entire Japanese archipelago had become a laboratory for high-altitude destruction. The final assessment of the B-29's impact was not found in the number of buildings destroyed, but in the total psychological and structural collapse of a nation that realized it was defenseless against a power it could not even touch. In the final months, the shock that had begun with the Silver Phantom turned into a paralyzed resignation. Japanese commanders, once proud of their tactical prowess, sat in underground bunkers, tracking B-29 formations that flew with absolute impunity. The Silver Giants had transitioned from daylight precision bombing to low-level night incendiary raids led by General Curtis LeMay. The B-29 had become a versatile monster, capable of burning entire cities to the ground in a single night. The Japanese commanders were shocked to find that even when the B-29s dropped to lower altitudes, their fighters were now too few, their fuel was too scarce, and their pilots were too green to mount a meaningful defense. The final assessment by Japanese military historians and surviving officers focused on the B-29's role as the total weapon. It was the machine that delivered the atomic bombs to Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But even before those world-shaking events, the B-29 had already won the war. It had mined the Japanese harbors from the air, starving the nation of food and fuel. It had destroyed the aircraft factories, ensuring that no new Zero would ever rise to challenge it. The B-29 didn't just break the Japanese military, it broke the Japanese industrial base and ultimately the will of the people. When the surrender was finally signed aboard the USS Missouri, a massive formation of nearly 500 B-29s flew overhead, their silver wings blotting out the sun. To the Japanese officials on deck, it was the final, crushing period at the end of a long sentence of defeat. Their assessment was clear. Japan had been defeated by a nation that had successfully weaponized the stratosphere. They had been fighting a 19th century war of honor against a 20th century war of science. The legacy of the B-29 in Japan remains a haunting one. It proved that in the modern era, national sovereignty is only as strong as the ability to defend one's airspace. The end of the sky meant that a country's heart could be reached and stopped by a crew sitting in a pressurized cabin thousands of miles from their own shores. For the Japanese commanders who lived through it, the B-29 was the ultimate teacher of a brutal lesson. When the enemy flies too high to be reached, the only thing left to do is watch the horizon and wait for the end. The era of the samurai was over. The era of the strategic bomber had changed the world forever.